Hello, friends. Thank you for being with me. Subscribe, like, and let's get started.
The hot summer sun was already sinking towards the horizon. Jack stood at the grill in the shade of a spreading oak tree, glancing at the assembled guests. Sarah, his wife, circled among her colleagues, giving them her trademark smile. The whole evening was her idea, a barbecue for new colleagues organized to strengthen ties. Jack didn't like noisy gatherings, especially with people he barely knew, but he agreed for her sake. Sarah's colleagues behaved as if they were not at a friendly meeting, but at a corporate meeting where everyone was trying to make an impression. The conversations revolved around their projects, successes, and ambitions. Jack tried to stay away, limiting himself to the role of a silent cook, focused on roasting steaks. As he took the last portion of meat off the grill and wiped the sweat from his face, Jack noticed Sarah slip into the kitchen with a tray of dirty dishes. Her gait was tense, as if she was considering something. It was a small detail that an ordinary person might not have noticed. But Jack knew Sarah too well. He decided to take a break and headed to the trash can to throw away the remnants of packages and napkins. When the lid of the container slammed shut with a thud, Jack suddenly felt a cold stab of intuition, something like déjà vu, mixed with anxiety. His gaze involuntarily slid to the lighted kitchen. Inside, Sarah was standing at the table, her movements fast and focused. She was holding an envelope, which apparently she had just taken out of her pocket. First, she glanced at the back door leading to the terrace, and then carefully opened the envelope. Jack retreated into the shade of a tree, watching her actions through the glass. Sarah carefully poured the contents of the envelope into a glass. Her hand slid to the spoon, and she began to stir the powder with such concentration, as if she were preparing a culinary masterpiece. Seeing this, Jack felt a chill run down his spine. She looked in his direction again, and Jack quickly pretended to be fiddling with the trash can. Sarah, obviously satisfied, returned to her preparations. "Jack, are you coming soon?" Her voice sounded unexpectedly close. Sarah was standing on the threshold, smiling so warmly and sincerely that he had a thought. Maybe I'm just too suspicious. "Yes, just a couple more minutes," he replied, hiding his excitement behind a slight smile. When she disappeared through the door, Jack refused to believe the worst, but something about her behavior bothered him. He returned to the grill, picked up a brush, and began to clean it, pretending that everything was fine, but continued to keep an eye on the house out of the corner of his eye. Soon Sarah returned, carrying a tray of glasses. Jack noticed the very drink she had made. Her footsteps were light, as if she was sure no one had noticed anything. She put the glass down on the table and, without saying a word, headed back to the guests. Jack froze. He knew that this glass was meant for him. Whatever it was, he had to figure it out. Going to the table, he took the drink and held it to his nose. The smell was normal, but his wariness only increased. He pretended to take a sip, but in fact only pressed the glass to his lips. Sarah glanced at him from around the corner. He felt her gaze without even turning around. She was waiting for a reaction. Jack put the glass back on the table, ostensibly already drunk, and returned to his duties on the terrace. Questions swirled in his head, but the answers were still hidden. As the evening drew to a close, Jack decided to wait, observe, and, if necessary, act. When night fell, Jack lay in the dark guest bedroom, trying to keep his breathing even. His mind was spinning because of the suspicions that had arisen during the day. He could hear the muffled sounds of footsteps, laughter, and voices coming from the living room. Sarah and her colleagues stayed in the house, although the rest of the guests had long since left. Jack wasn't prepared for what he was about to hear. He decided it was better to wait for the moment to act for sure. His body was frozen, as if frozen in anticipation, but his thoughts were boiling. The scene that unfolded earlier in the kitchen was too strange to ignore. Why did Sarah add something to his drink and then watch with exaggerated calmness as he drank it? The answers could only be here in this house. Footsteps in the hallway made his heart sink. The bedroom door opened a crack and dim light filled the room. Sarah quietly walked over to his bed and bent down. Jack could feel her presence, the scent of her perfume, her warm breath. She leaned closer, touched his face to see if he would wake up. He was ready. Trembling slightly, He continued to simulate deep sleep. "I'm sorry, Jack," she whispered so softly that he could barely make out the words. Her footsteps retreated, and the door closed again. Jack cautiously opened his eyes. His assumptions were confirmed. She's really up to something. After waiting for about 10 minutes, he got out of bed and crept to the door. Opening it barely a millimeter, Jack peered into the hallway. Sarah had long since disappeared from sight, but the light in the living room was shining through the doorway, inviting Jack to find out the truth. He walked quietly down the hallway, avoiding areas where the floor creaked, until he was around the corner leading to the living room. Pressing himself against the wall, he looked through the crack. The scene he saw caught him off guard. In the dim light, Sarah was sitting on the couch with Mark Hughes, her loudest and most opinionated colleague. Andrew was standing in front of him, holding a glass of wine and saying something, making the others laugh. The atmosphere was too relaxed, too intimate. Jack felt the blood rush to his face, but he forced himself to remain invisible. Mark, who was sitting next to her, leaned into her ear, whispering something that made her laugh, but this laughter seemed chilling to Jack. And now came the moment that tore down the last barriers. Mark leaned over to Sarah and lightly put his hand on her shoulder. Instead of pulling away, she leaned closer to him and whispered something in his ear. The laughter overlapping with their movements was like thunder to Jack. He saw Andrew take off his jacket and come closer, and the other men surrounded her, as if on an unspoken signal. Sarah reached out to Mark, lightly touching his face, and then looked at the others with an expression of a mixture of pleasure and detachment. He wanted to scream, but the sound stuck in his throat. A strange dance began in the room. The movements of the colleagues seemed to be synchronized, devoid of individuality. Sarah was laughing, her voice breaking the silence, leaving a cold echo in its wake. Jack tried to turn away, but he couldn't. It all looked like a scene from an adult movie that he didn't want to watch. Jack hurried back into the bedroom. His breathing was labored, his hands were shaking, but his mind was clear. He found the phone, activated the video recording, and returned to his place at the doorway. The camera was aimed precisely at the audience. He filmed Mark and Sarah exchanging glances during their intimacy, then Andrew and his colleagues waiting for their turn. The recording went on for a few more minutes, but Jack knew that he had had enough. Back in the bedroom, he watched the video. All he had to do was make sure it wasn't a figment of his imagination. Every frame confirmed his worst fears. My heart was pounding like a hammer. He knew he couldn't leave it like that. But now, at night, he could only prepare for the next step. The morning came calm and serene, as if that terrible night had never happened. Jack woke up in the guest bedroom, but instead of feeling relieved, he felt heavy. The events of the previous day were spinning in my head like a broken record. He watched the recording on his phone several times, but it didn't get any less real. He knew it couldn't be delayed. The time has come. Sarah was already in the kitchen when Jack came in, trying to look calm. Her hair was neatly pulled back into a high ponytail, and her movements were light, almost carefree. She smiled at him as if nothing had happened. "Good morning, Jack," she said without looking up from the coffee maker. "You look like you didn't sleep well. Everything is fine?" Jack didn't answer right away, standing in the doorway and watching her. How could she be so calm when she knew he'd been in the house all night? Her behavior only added fuel to the fire of his anger. "You and I have a lot to talk about," he said, trying to keep his voice level. Sarah turned around, raising an eyebrow in mock surprise. "Of course, dear. Something happened?" She looked at him with feigned concern, but her eyes remained cold. Jack stepped closer, taking his phone out of his pocket. His hands no longer trembled, and his voice became firm. "I know everything, Sarah. Everything that happened last night. I saw everything, and recorded it on the phone camera." Her expression froze for a moment. He saw a flash of shock and confusion on her face, but she quickly pulled herself together. Her lips formed a thin line, and then she folded her arms across her chest. "Have you been following me?" "What is it?" she asked with cold defiance. "Film me without permission? Are you serious, Jack? Have you been watching? Have you filmed it?" He could barely keep himself from snapping. "I've seen what you've been doing with Mark and Andrew and all of them, by your colleagues. I saw what was going on in this living room. Do you want to talk about followed?" Sarah, I'm not the one who crossed the line here. She chuckled, shaking her head as if he'd said something funny. You're being dramatic as always. Jack, it's just a job. What you saw, it's none of your business. These words startled him. He took a step closer, looking her straight in the eye. None of my business? Sarah, this is our house. This is our marriage. And you're saying it's none of my business? She sighed, as if he was a schoolboy who didn't understand a simple lesson. Jack, let me explain. All this, she waved her hand, was necessary for my career. If it wasn't for me, we would still be living in this house, barely making ends meet. I've done everything to take us to a new level. And yes, I had to make decisions that you might not like. But I'm the boss of this family. I decide what is right and what is wrong. Are you in charge? Jack felt a wave of rage wash over him. Are you justifying betrayal by calling it right? You destroyed everything we had. For what? For a promotion? Sarah abruptly put her coffee cup down on the table. Yes, for the sake of promotion. Stop it, she shouted. You have no idea what it means to be a woman in a man's world. They would never have accepted me if I hadn't found a way to convince them. It's all for us, Jack. For you. For the future of our family. The future of our family? Are you out of your mind? His voice broke. Do you even know what you're saying? It's not about family, Sarah. It's about you. Your ambitions. Your lies. She stepped closer, now looking down at him, her face contorted in disdain. Jack, you've always been a weakling. From the very beginning. If it wasn't for me, you wouldn't have gotten anywhere. You're not a man, you're a ballast. I did everything so that we could have a normal life, and you still dare to reproach me? Her words hurt him. Jack stood silently, absorbing her anger and contempt. Suddenly, he felt strangely calm, as if all his emotions had burned out. He took a step back, putting the phone on the table. If that's what you think, Sarah, he said softly, then we're done. She frowned, her confidence faltering. What are you going to do? What is it? She asked defiantly, but there was a note of uncertainty in her voice. Jack didn't answer. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing in silence. Jack entered the living room, but stopped at the window, looking out at the sunlight. His heart was still pounding, but his thoughts were finally starting to clear up. He heard Sarah follow him into the room, her footsteps sounding fast and determined. She wasn't going to give in. Don't you dare walk away from the conversation, Jack. Her voice got louder, almost a scream. If you have something to say, say it now. Jack turned around slowly. Her face was tense, but there was something in her eyes that he hadn't seen before desperation. However, instead of remorse breaking through her armor, Sarah continued to attack. Do you think that you are such a hero? You recorded something on your phone, and now you think that you have the right to judge me? She pointed sharply at his pocket. You don't understand anything, Jack. It's just a game. You'll never understand how the real world works. A game? Jack chuckled, bitterly and coldly. You call our marriage a game? Our life? Everything we built together? Sarah crossed her arms over her chest and looked at him as if he was a child who needed to be taught a lesson. I don't have to explain myself to you. You can get mad all you want, but I'm not going to apologize for doing what I think is right. You don't even see that everything has already been destroyed, do you? Jack took a step closer, his voice cold and harsh. You think you're in control of everything, that you're in no danger. But this time, Sarah, you're wrong. Her lips twitched, but she immediately regained her confidence. What do you want to say? What are you going to do, weakling? Will you leave? Well, get lost, Jack. The door is open. He stared at her in silence, and then slowly took out his phone. Sarah tensed, her self-confidence weakened, and now there was a note of fear in her voice. Jack! Her tone changed, became softer. Please don't do anything stupid. Let's talk. You're just angry. You don't understand. I understand enough, he interrupted. You've chosen your side, Sarah. Now it's my turn. He unlocked the phone, opened the recording, and, without taking his eyes off her face, sent it to the cloud storage. She paled as she realized that the copy was now out of her control. Are you crazy? She shouted, running up to him. You will destroy everything. And for what? To get back at me? This is stupid, Jack. You're just making it worse. Jack dodged her hands, which were trying to snatch the phone away. His face remained stony, and his voice was calm. You've already destroyed everything, Sarah. I just took the first step towards making you finally responsible for this. Sarah froze. She stood in front of him, breathing heavily, and for the first time he saw fear in her eyes, not anger. This moment could have been a climax if he had felt satisfied, but all that was inside was emptiness. This is just the beginning, Sarah, he said softly. Now you'll regret it. I'll show you what a wimp I am. He walked around her and headed for the door, leaving her standing in the deserted living room. Her faint cry followed him. You don't understand. You're not getting anywhere with this. But Jack wasn't listening anymore. He knew that his decision had been made, and there was no turning back. The house fell into a gloomy silence. Sarah, left in the living room, tried to digest what was happening, but Jack no longer wanted to hear it. He went into the bedroom, closed the door, and leaned back against it, feeling his anger give way to cold determination. He wasn't going to take it anymore. The phone in his hand became an instrument of truth, proof that his senses were not deceiving him. He unlocked the device and reopened the video. The faces of Sarah and her colleagues were clearly visible, as was everything that was happening. These shots are his ticket to justice. Jack spent several minutes looking through the company's contacts. He knew that Sarah worked in the human resources department of a large corporation, and every name he saw in the corporate address book aroused mixed feelings in him. He searched for a long time for a suitable contact, until he came across the name of the head of the human resources department, Linda Marsh. Linda Marsh, HR director. Great, Jack thought, taking a few deep breaths to calm down. He knew that there could not be one step back. His fingers were trembling, but he was sure that if Sarah had ruined their marriage, he would ruin her career. He opened the mail application and started writing a letter. Topic: behavior that undermines corporate values. Dear Ms. Marsh, I believe that I am obliged to inform you about the actions of several employees of your company, which not only violate the corporate code, but also can cause serious damage to the reputation of Halifax Industries. The attached video speaks for itself. Please kindly consider this as an urgent matter. Sincerely yours, Anonymous. He attached the file with the recording, checked the email again, and pressed the send button. His heart stopped for a moment, and then resumed its frantic rhythm. Everything was done. Now the fun begins. The next morning, when Sarah got up, she no longer radiated confidence. Jack noticed how her eyes darted and her movements became abrupt. She tried to act as if nothing had happened, but the tension in her figure gave her away. Aren't you going to tell me what you did? What is it? She finally asked, glancing across the table where Jack was leisurely drinking coffee. He looked up, his face unreadable. I did what I had to do, Sarah. Now it's your turn to find out what it means to be truly humiliated. Sarah looked scared but tried to hide it. She shook her head and turned away, pretending that she didn't care about this conversation. Jack calmly continued his breakfast, looking at his watch. He knew that during business hours the company would start responding to his letter. And he was not mistaken. Sarah's phone rang a little after 10 in the morning. She froze when she saw Linda Marsh's name on the screen. Jack noticed how her hands were shaking when she picked up the phone. Yes, Linda? She said, trying to keep her voice even. But judging by her expression, the conversation didn't go the way she expected. Jack couldn't hear the words, but he could see the color gradually fading from her face. After a few seconds, she quickly stood up, ending the conversation with a short, I'll be right there. Problems at work? He asked innocently as she grabbed the bag. Sarah turned around, her eyes flashing. Did you do that? Did you send something to work? You bastard? She hissed like a cornered animal. You'll find out when you get there, sweetheart. He replied calmly with a malicious smile. She shot a look full of hatred and stormed out the door, slamming it so that the walls shook. Jack was sitting on the couch and looking out the window when the clock struck noon. He imagined how events were unfolding in the Halifax Industries office right now. It seemed to him that he could hear the hum of voices, the gossip of colleagues discussing the video. Sarah returned home only in the evening. Her face was pale and her eyes were red, as if she had spent the whole day in tears. She silently entered, threw her bag on the floor, and fell on the sofa. She sat with her head down for a few minutes, and then finally looked up at Jack. They suspended me, she said in a hoarse voice, until an investigation is conducted. Jack looked at her without pity. This is just the beginning. Sarah stood up, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe what was happening. You've ruined everything, Jack. You don't even understand what that means. No, Sarah, he said, his voice low but firm. You ruined everything. I just showed everyone the truth. Sarah slammed her fist down on the back of the sofa. Her face contorted with a mixture of anger and despair. She walked slowly towards Jack, her eyes burning with hatred. You think you're a hero, don't you? Do you think you've won? She hissed. But you know what? You're just a weakling who couldn't handle reality. You were a loser before me, Jack, and you will always be one. Jack sat in silence, his gaze fixed, as if her words no longer had any power over him. He got up from the couch and stood right in front of her, hands in his pockets. His voice was as cold as steel. Maybe, Sarah, I was a weakling. Maybe I believed in you for too long. But now I see who you really are. And you know, you've lost everything. Me, our family, and your career. This is your reality now. Her lips twitched, but she quickly pulled herself together. She took a step back, giving him a look full of contempt. Do you think I needed you? I built this life on my own, without you. And I will rebuild everything that you destroyed, without you. Jack chuckled and turned to the window. Then start right now, Sarah. But know this. No one who has seen this video will forget. And he certainly won't forgive me. Sarah tried to say something, but her voice was gone. She grabbed her bag and left the house, slamming the door loudly. Jack remained standing at the window, watching as her car quickly disappeared around the bend. The house fell silent. At first glance, Jack looked calm, but a storm was raging inside him. He knew that he had just done something that would change their lives forever. His emotions were mixed: relief, anger, pain, and a strange feeling of emptiness. He went to the bar, poured himself a glass of whiskey, and sat down at the kitchen table. Watching the video, he no longer felt the same emotions as the first time. Now it was something like a weapon for him, which he had already used. But what's next? The phone rang, breaking the silence. The screen flashed the name of an old friend, Mike, the one who once helped him figure out his life. Jack thought about it, but picked up the phone anyway. Hi, Mike. His voice was a little husky. Jack, I heard. Sarah, it's true? His friend's voice was worried. Jack closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose with his fingers for a moment. Yes, it's true. Everything came out, and now she has no way back. So do you, Mike said. Look, you're on edge right now, but you need to think about what's going to happen next. Do you want this to define your life? Or are you ready to move on? Jack was silent, considering his friend's words. He understood that this battle was over, but life went on. He had to build something new out of the rubble of what had once been their common life. You're right, Mike. It's time to move on, he finally said, his voice becoming more confident. After hanging up the phone, Jack went out onto the porch, breathing in the cool evening air. His heart was still heavy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a faint glimmer of hope. Yes, Sarah chose her path, and he chose his own. And no matter how difficult it was, he was going to move on. In the morning, Jack was reading the news headlines on his tablet. The scandal surrounding Halifax Industries has already spilled out. The corporate crisis was discussed in the morning news releases, and users posted a video on social networks, which miraculously turned out to be publicly available. Jack wasn't smiling or celebrating. He was just watching. When Sarah returned home, her steps were heavy and her shoulders slumped. She dropped her bag on the floor and collapsed onto the sofa. She sat in silence for a few minutes, as if gathering her thoughts, and then looked at Jack. You got your way, she whispered. I was suspended. They'll figure it out. Mark and the others too. And all because of you. Jack put down his tablet and looked at her. Is it because of me? Or is it because of you, Sarah? You've made a choice. Now you're reaping the benefits. She bit her lip, her eyes filled with tears, but she turned away, trying to hide it. You ruined my life, Jack. He got up and went to the door. No, Sarah, you ruined our lives, and I just stopped you. With that, he left the house, leaving her to sit in silence. The next day, it became known that the management of Halifax Industries decided to fire all participants in the scandal in order to save the company's reputation. Sarah lost her job, as did Mark, Andrew, and her other colleagues. The families of some of them began to crumble when the truth came out. Sarah was left alone. Her friends turned away from her, and harassment began on social networks. Jack watched it all from the sidelines. He felt no joy, only a cold relief. The consequences of her actions caught up with her, as he expected. It hurt him to see what their life had become, but he knew that now he could start over without her. Jack was sitting on the porch of his house, looking at the scarlet sunset. There was still a faint smell of rain in the air, and this moment seemed peaceful. But his thoughts were far from calm. The last few months have been a real challenge for him. The scandal, the destruction of his marriage, the confrontation with his own pain, all this devastated him. But now, looking at the horizon, Jack felt a faint glimmer of hope. He knew he couldn't let the bitterness consume him anymore. Sarah was gone from his life, and no matter how painful it was, he had to accept it as a fresh start. The next morning, Jack started with a small step. He opened his laptop and searched for local courses. He was always interested in photography, but he never found time for it. Now he decided it was worth a try. On the same day, he enrolled in the course Fundamentals of Art Photography. He liked the idea of looking at the world differently, through a lens in search of beauty where he had not noticed it before. His classes started a week later, and on the first day Jack felt that he had made the right choice. The teacher, an elderly man named Tom, enthusiastically talked about the magic of light and composition. Jack quickly got carried away with the process, forgetting about his problems. His first work, a photograph of the old bridge at dawn, became for him a symbol of the transition from the old to the new. At home, Jack began to sort out old things that reminded him of Sarah. Photos, letters, gifts. All this was carefully packed and put away in the far corner of the garage. He couldn't get rid of them completely, but he didn't want to leave them in a prominent place anymore. This process was painful, but liberating. One day, going through the boxes, he found an old map on which he had once marked the places he dreamed of visiting. Among them were Yellowstone National Park, the Grand Canyon, and the Pacific Coast. This map became a new target for him. Jack decided that now his life would be focused on realizing these dreams. A few months later, his life changed beyond recognition. Jack started spending more time outdoors, meeting new people, and sharing his photos on social media. His work began to attract attention, and soon one of the local galleries offered him an exhibition. It was a surprise to him. He stood in front of his photographs hanging on the gallery walls and felt proud of what he had achieved. His photographs were full of life and emotion, reflecting not only nature, but also his own journey from pain to healing. One evening, when the exhibition was over, Jack was sitting in a cafe, flipping through photos on his phone. Rachel sat down at the table next to him. Her smile was warm, and her gaze was sincere. "You know," she said, looking at one of his photographs, "you did it. You found yourself." Jack thought for a moment and smiled back. "Perhaps yes, but this is just the beginning." These words became true for him. He no longer felt tied to the past. Life was in front of him, and he was ready for new challenges and adventures. His journey continued, and now he was in control of its direction. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.